As we continue the Washington Center January program on politics and the media, I'm joined by a familiar face to people who know television news, Mr. Marvin Kalb. Sir, I'd like to begin with asking you to extend a little bit on the conversation that you had with the students just a few minutes ago in the seminar, particularly relating to the book that your daughter and you have written called A Haunting Legacy, and how it compares the history of Vietnam to the current history, essentially,
Yes.
of Afghanistan. Expand on those conversations in terms of what was said inside, what is in the book,
Sure.
and what you think the legacy or the lessons are.
The most important legacy, I think, of the Vietnam War is don't allow yourself as a nation to be sucked into something that you do not understand. At the time that the United States got dragged in very slowly into the Vietnam experience, which goes way back to the Truman administration, then Eisenhower, and then Kennedy with advisors, and then Johnson with many troops, until we had 548,000 Americans in South Vietnam, a very small country. We did not know anything truly about the history of Vietnam, the religion of Vietnam, the culture of Vietnam, the people of Vietnam, and yet we fought there because it was part of a Cold War scenario in which we persuaded ourselves that the loss of South Vietnam would be terribly injurious to the interests of the United States, which in fact proved not to be the case in spades. However, at that time, that ignorance at the highest level of government led into this most unfortunate war. The linkage of that to Afghanistan is very clear from the comment made by General McChrystal, who was one of the commanders of American forces and Allied forces in Afghanistan for the better part of a year. McChrystal, at a recent appearance at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, said that one of the things that troubled him the most about our experience in Afghanistan is that we know so little about what is happening there. Well, I mean, that sounded absolutely crazy to me. What do you mean, General, we know so little? We got all these reporters there. We're absorbed with it. There are congressional hearings on this. You yourself led our forces. You're a smart guy. What's going on here? He said, the truth is, we know very little about it. We know about war. We constitute today a magnificent fighting machine. But why we are using this machine in Afghanistan is still not entirely clear. I am happy to say, and I hope it works out, that these, quote, secret negotiations between the US, the Taliban, and the Karzai government end up with some resolution of the war. I am not saying that there's going to be buddy-buddy, we'll live a happy life together. It's not going to happen that way. But at least it's enough of a resolution that allows us to get out.
You use the term machine. I don't know if it's fair to equate the media to a machine as well, but I will, just to sort of extend the conversation. You experienced the Vietnam period and the Vietnam War as a journalist. You're now experiencing what is taking place in Afghanistan less as a journalist and more as an academician or a scholar. From a media standpoint, what you're seeing today, does it concern you? Are you satisfied? Are the media, in other words, doing the kind of job you would expect in comparison to what you and your colleagues were able to do during Vietnam, with far less technology during that time as well?
Absolutely. It's a very good question, and it's one that I think about a lot, I talk about a lot, and I think a number of my colleagues of my vintage also talk about. When the war really got started in earnest, shortly after 9/11, we sent troops into Afghanistan. The Taliban was in power then. We kicked them out. We had hundreds of American reporters there covering the war. So even if they were not expert in Afghan history, they were expert as journalists in covering the war, and I think they did a very good job. They were excellent. Very brave, courageous reporting. Since that time, for reasons relating to budgetary constraints, the media has cut back dramatically in the number of people who are in Afghanistan covering the war. The upshot is that fewer people cover a more complex political and military environment, and obviously, almost by definition, can't do as good a job. They do as well as they could, but they can't do as good a job because we are still dealing with a highly complex military environment, political environment, the negotiations now. There ought to be a number of reporters in Doha where the negotiations are taking place. I doubt that there will be. More reporters covering the battlefield. There will not be. We are now in a period of, as a nation, sort of psychological retrenchment. And journalism is simply part of the American experience. So as the United States pulls back, journalism pulls back. And we now cover less, are interested in less, see less, understand less. And this is all to the detriment, I think, of the national interest of the country.
With the retrenchment, is it possible, therefore, looking at this obviously being calendar year 2012, that there might be, and I say that I think optimistically and hopefully not naively, more and better coverage of the presidential elections than perhaps we've seen in years past?
Well, you know, I would love to say yes. I really would. I would be thrilled to say yes, but I'd be lying to myself and to you. You can't say yes. Look, what happened, I mean, we're speaking on a Wednesday morning. Last night, New Hampshire happened and Romney won. There was a story in the Washington Post today written by Dana Milbank about how there was really no story in New Hampshire, and yet there were hundreds of reporters and cameramen there. Mm-hmm. If half of them had been in Afghanistan, we'd all be better off. But there really was not that big a story in New Hampshire. And time again, the candidates would be speaking to the cameras that surrounded them, making it appear as if they were speaking to the people of New Hampshire. But they weren't. There were, in many cases, a dozen citizens of New Hampshire, and quite literally scores of reporters, in some cases adding up to 100 journalists, and maybe a dozen citizens. It's crazy. That's not coverage. I mean, that's just having a lot of cameras around. I think that we've got to be much more discriminating. If in fact, and I believe it to be true, there is a cutback based on budgetary constraints in journalism today, then use the money that you've got more intelligently and prioritize more clearly. We make of the campaign, I was about to say more than it is, but it is the practicing of American democracy, and there is really nothing better. But I think what I mean to say is that we inflate the importance of an event and therefore mislead the American people into thinking that they're watching something of phenomenal power, moment, importance, when it isn't. And nobody can just say, hey, ladies and gentlemen in television land, this is really not that important. Because if you say that, you're going to lose your you're going to lose your ratings and lose your position in the network hierarchy, and then probably the cameraman gets fired. I don't want that to happen. Just prioritize more clearly, be more honest, under no conditions inflate reality. Think very carefully about what the ultimate purpose of a free press is. It is to provide popular access to stories that otherwise the people could not on their own see. So they trust the journalist to be there for them and to convey that reality to them. But that reality has to be conveyed honestly. It cannot be conveyed in an inflated, hyped way simply for ratings. Ratings have to do with business. Journalism has to do with democracy. And there is a difference. Journalism, a free press, is the best guarantor of a free society. All over the world where I've gone as a journalist, I can tell you flat out, I know the minute I get off the plane and I walk into the airport and go to a kiosk and look at newspapers, I can tell you simply by the look of the newspapers whether I'm in a free country or a dictatorship or an autocracy. You can see immediately. And what is it? Because the press is the upfront organization. And with a free press, you can have a free, open, virile democracy. And without one, you're dead in the water.
One more question, which I think to some extent you've already answered, but I'm going to borrow something that Mike McCurry, the former speaker,
Sure.
or the former press secretary, I'm
Right.
sorry, for President Clinton said the other day. One of the questions he was asked was, if you had a magic wand and could simply change the political process, what would you do? Substitute the word media in the case for politics, and let me pose that question to you again, realizing to some extent you have already answered it. If you had the magic wand and could change the media process in any way, what one or two or perhaps more things would you do? Having absolute carte blanche, and it would happen.
Well, I would go back to that time before the journalist became a professional journalist. I would go back to her educational background. I would make absolutely sure, to the degree that it's possible, that future journalists picked up foreign languages. Not all the world speaks English. I would have every journalist acquire a specialization of some sort, maybe in economics, maybe in history, maybe area studies like knowing Russia and all of the small countries around it, something that means that when you become the reporter and you're sent out into the field, you know something serious about what it is that you're discussing. Words are very cheap, but if words can convey knowledge and even wisdom, how much better off we'd all be.
It's a pleasure talking to you this morning. Thank
My
you.
pleasure.
Thank you.